Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I work at IE Business School Publishing, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Do you have something you'd like some help with? Ask our guests. Go to professorgame.com/question and get your question answered in a future episode. And hello, engagers. Today we have Dave Eng. So Dave, are you prepared to engage?
Yeah, let's do it, Rob.
Let's do this, Dave. So the first thing that we always get into with our guests is what is their background. And Dave is an educational doctor. He's an intellectual and creative educator, designer, and researcher who combines games, theory, and technology to define the next practice. To define next practice. We'll probably get into what that means further on. And he is currently consulting privately for colleges and universities on game-based learning, gamification, higher education administration, and instructional design. He loves the student affairs community and has helped many entry professionals get their foot in the door with their first position. So his research interests include learning theory, technology, and of course, games. So Dave, is there anything we missed from that intro that you would like to let us know?
I guess the only thing for correction is it's Eng. So my name is Dave Eng.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It gets messed up pretty frequently for a 3-letter last name.
Well, that happens. So the first thing that we're going to get into today with questions-wise, Dave, is what does a regular day with you look like?
Sure. So regular day for me is I work at home now remotely. Most of my consulting work doesn't require me to be anywhere specifically, like physically located. So I am that kind of guy that gets up. I listen to podcasts like right in the morning. So if Professor Game is queued up on there, I start listening to some Professor Game. I have some coffee. I check some emails. Sometimes I have some Zoom or some video meetings set up with some of my clients where I communicate with them there. And then I always try to work out a little bit, hike or go to the gym. I'm a big Fitbit user, so I guess that is how gamification has really changed and shaped my life because I'm always trying to get my 10,000 steps a day. And then at night, I'm also always trying to, I have a very large tabletop board game collection. So I'm always trying to get some of those games to the table to play with friends or family. And then ironically, one of the last things I do before I go to sleep is I go on Kickstarter and I see what are the latest tabletop board games available for me to back because I already know I have way too many board games, but I always have that fear of missing out on something really cool or really awesome. So that is the typical day for me. It has podcasts, it has technology, and it has games in there in some regards.
Do you have some sort of community to play games with, or are you just a hoarder of games?
Well, one, I am a hoarder of games. I make no bones about that. I told myself I would limit myself to one IKEA shelf full of games. That was a year ago. I now have 4 IKEA shelves full of games, and I really, really need to pare back because they're going to, if I get any more games, then they're going to have to start paying rent because it's like having another roommate here.
There's no looking back now.
I got to start giving them away or selling them or something. But I do have a community. I was working at a small liberal arts college over here in the New York metropolitan area. I have some students that I used to play with there. Since I left, I've started kind of like our own little game group. So I'm actually going to go play with them tonight. We meet up at a local Panera Bread to just sit there, relax, eat, and play games. Other than that, I'm part of a couple of different design, playtesting tabletop groups. One is in New York, one is in New Jersey. So I play with them sometimes. And then usually whenever I can get together with my family members, especially like my extended family, they love board games. They love tabletop games and their kids, about 7 and 10 years old. They also like playing games. So I have no shortage of people to play with. I just really need more time to play tabletop games.
There's not enough time to play games ever, no matter what they tell you.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. So Dave, is there a story that you could tell us that would be what you could call your favorite fail or failure when using game-based learning, or when you know, consulting about gamification, that you can actually tell that it set up your future for success, or even from a massive learning in that regard?
Yeah, so for me, I started using games-based learning when I was working with my student staff. So I used to work in student affairs at the college I was talking about before, and that really involves supporting our students outside the classroom. So one of my main responsibilities was putting together our new student orientation program that welcomes new students to our campus. Part of that is hiring a staff of students called the orientation leaders, and those orientation leaders would help guide those new students through the process. So my philosophy and my pedagogy for that was I need this group of students to be really comfortable with each other before I can train them to work together as a staff. So part of that was going on a training, and we would go away to a YMCA camp, doing outdoor adventure stuff for 2 days, and we come back to campus and we would do more orientation related stuff. But since they're working with me, they knew that games were going to be involved in some way. So one of my favorite games to play with my students is one called Werewolf. If you ever played Mafia or something like that, it's basically the same thing. It's a hit and roll game. One of the students or a couple of the students are the werewolves, and they are trying to defeat all the other students who are the villagers. And that was a great game because it established rapport between students. They became comfortable with each other. They just felt they could trust each other. And we were all able to accomplish this through this game that really doesn't require any components. You just need like a deck of cards to play them. Fast forward to this past year, I was teaching a communication arts public speaking course, and I wanted to play Werewolf as part of that because I felt that in Werewolf, a lot of the game is trying to convince people you are one thing when really you're something else. So it's really about creating a narrative and really targets persuasive speech. But what ended up happening was that's all my students wanted to play. Like that was only supposed to be one piece of content for 1 week out of 15 weeks, but they wanted to play that game like on week 4, 5, 6, 7. And I said, no, guys, we have to concentrate on these other types of speeches, like informative speeches and instructive speeches, but they really wanted to play Werewolf. So I guess the good part is that I've introduced that game to a lot of different people. The bad part is that I was not able to reel that class in from playing games other than Werewolf.
That's an interesting story of too much engagement with a game to learn from that. However, is there something that you would like to bring up that you would say is a key learning, or something you would do differently, or that you have done differently after having such an experience?
So particularly when it comes to games-based learning, the one thing that I would recommend other people do if they're going to use it is that when you use games-based learning, you're going to use some commercially available game or some game that you could have created for this purpose. But the most important learning outcome is that you connect why that game matters for what you're trying to teach. So what I told my students was, we're playing this game specifically because I want all of you to become comfortable with each other, talking with each other, and working with each other. That is the one outcome. Like, I don't care whether you win or lose or do anything else. That is the one outcome. And then afterwards, after we play, we really discuss and talk about, like what happened in the game, how you were feeling, how do you think that this really connected to those different learning outcomes. So what I would communicate to other professionals is that you just can't play games and hope that they learn. You really have to walk them through the process. Like, games for me are very much a tool in helping people reach those different learning outcomes. But my bullet pointed answer is you just can't play games and hope that people learn. You really have to use it as a formative tool like you would anything else in structuring that conversation.
Fantastic. And so if you had the occasion once again to do it like exactly the same, what you would do is perhaps bring it up to the students, explain why you're playing that game, either before or after, and then having some sort of debriefing session is what I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I changed up in future iterations of that class, and also when I used playing Werewolf in future orientation teams, just trying to bring up the fact that this is why we're playing the game, this is what happens, and afterwards we're going to talk about that experience.
Fantastic. So that makes a lot of sense. It's something that our experience at the business school I work in is mainly related to things like simulations, and definitely the second stage, or that debriefing as we call it, is fundamental, because it's there even if people did learn something, like solidifying that knowledge and like that metacognition of learning, that realizing that you actually learned, is fundamental, because otherwise you may have it there and maybe some of the abilities will come naturally, but most of the things will not. And in that sense, it's it's going to be very difficult to solidify all that learning that you made there. And that's a fundamental stage for learning.
Without that, people just remember that they played a game, but they don't remember why they played.
Exactly, or what they learned, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So fantastic. Before we move on to the next question, this is something we were talking about in the pre-interview chat, but could you give us a sentence or a short paragraph definition of what you mean by game-based learning?
So games-based learning is using either commercial games or games that you may have created for a specific learning outcome, and using that as your content for achieving that specific learning outcome. So for me, it was using Werewolf. Werewolf was really the activity that I had students do in order for them to become more socially acclimated to each other and more comfortable working with each other. It's not the only thing I could have done. We could have had everyone go around in a circle and tell them a little bit about themselves and their background and why they're on the orientation team. And that would have been an applicable way of accomplishing it. But for me, I really wanted it to be fun. I wanted it to be intuitive, and I wanted it to be memorable and an experience that everyone could enjoy. So that's why I chose to use Werewolf. But games-based learning is about using that game as the content. It's about using existing games in order to reach those learning outcomes.
Fantastic, and that makes a lot of sense. It's exactly what I was thinking, but I just wanted to make sure we have a common ground here for when we're speaking, and especially for the engagers, because I might be getting this wrong, but as far as I know, we haven't had an actual person who's dedicated specifically to games-based learning in this podcast. So I wanted to make sure everybody understands the same thing from this.
Sure.
In the same line of things that you have learned, is there some like big challenge that you faced, something that you're proud of that you would like to show off in a way of something you've faced and actually faced and used games-based learning and had some success with that? Can you share a story like that?
Not necessarily a games-based learning one, but I think this would be this would fall into the camp of gamification. What I did with my public speaking class was I flipped the grading scheme around, where originally it was you earn so many points, and when those points add up, that's how you determine a grade. Everything from D all the way up to A. But when I looked at it, you needed to do everything perfectly in order to earn an A in this class. But what I did was I flipped it around, and I had everyone start at 0, and I had them whenever they completed different assignments and projects and speeches, those would give them points, and when those points added up, they would get to their grade. While it sounds like the same thing, I argued it was different because originally in the gaming scheme, in the grading scheme, people were in the class were quote unquote playing the game of the class, but they were playing not to lose, which meant that they didn't want to make any mistakes, because whenever they made mistakes, they would get points taken off for an assignment, and that would lower their grade. What I did was when I flipped it around and I gave everyone 0 experience points, and I had them play up to 1,000 or whatever experience points, then they were playing to win. They knew that every assignment, everything that they could do to earn points, they would do in order to succeed in that area. But I also augmented it a little bit because I wanted to give students the ability to choose different challenges. So I made it so that you needed about 1,000 points to earn an A, but if you were to do single thing in the class completely perfectly, there would be about 2,000 points out there. So I gave people the access, and I also gave people the structure in which to succeed in this class by choosing what they wanted to do and really playing to win instead of playing not to lose.
That's super powerful. It's something that I think I've heard sometimes before, but the way in which you're explaining your reasoning behind and like the effect it can have on your students, it's fundamental engagers. And always think of what are the ways in which you're able to achieve your objectives. And the objective here of Dave was actually not just to have the students there and not just to have the students do the activities, but actually do the activities with an objective, with something they wanted to achieve, not being afraid of missing out, of missing their grade, but actually be striving towards success, which is what you're actually going for. And that allows you as well to commit mistakes, and that's something that's perfectly fine, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's something that I would like to take away from such an experience, Dave. And I think it was a fantastic, even though it seems like a very small thing, it can make all the difference if you're able to frame it correctly, as Dave did in his experience.
Exactly. Yep.
So now, Dave, we're going to move into the next question, and this has more to do with how do you approach these problems or these classes when you're going to create the content for a class. How do you approach a class when you're going to use gamification or games-based learning? Do you have some sort of a process that you follow?
Sure. So I like to start with a very stepped approach. And I think that this was something that came out doing my research in scaffolding for a very intuitive and hopefully gameful experience. And when I say scaffolding, I mean that we start out everyone on the very, very basic level, even like an almost like laughably easy level. So for my public speaking class, I came into that class knowing that, none of these students may have any sort of public speaking experience. How can we really address the very basic level of public speaking? And that just came out with in the very first class, you're going to give a 10-second speech. In the 10-second speech, you're going to say your full name, where you're from, your major, and then if you're a resident, where you live on campus, or if you're a commuter, what is your hometown? And that's it. And that was a graded assignment. Again, it was one part of many parts that added up to the grade for students for that class. But we started out at the very basic level because that's something that every student should be able to answer. From then, we went on to 20-second speeches, 30-second speeches, 60-second speeches, 2-minute speeches, 3-minute speeches, 4-minute speeches, 5-minute speeches. But the way I structured it was that we really built on what we learned last time, and we scaffolded it all the way up. I made that very first speech something that really no one could fail, or no one could conceivably fail, because everyone should know their full name, their class year, what their major is. And that's something, like everyone should be able to get that. So basically everyone got points for that. But as we went on through the semester, we tackled more difficult and more challenging speeches, but they were really scaffolded in the process to learn from what they did before and apply it to what they'll do in the future.
That is fantastic. So the stepped approach, the scaffolding is a fundamental game or gamification strategy, because just like in games, when you approach the game, who reads the instructions of video games nowadays? Like almost nobody. And if tabletop games would be possible as well, not to read the instructions, that would be perfect, because that's the way that we're approaching things. That's the way we're interacting with things nowadays. And that's exactly the approach that Dave took. He brought them into a place where they needed to know nothing they didn't know before. They were just there, and just by being in that class, they were able to perform the first tasks. And learning and picking up from there at every single step, you realize that they were learning a little bit more to be able to achieve the next level of success. And as always, it's possible to fail at some point. It's something that can happen, and that it's okay, but you're always as well trying to set them up for success so that they learn and that they get the learning objectives as well from such an experience. And Dave, I did have a question from your story before, because I was thinking, my mind stepped back, and I was thinking, because we do use this curve in the business school when setting up the grades. So when you were considering all this point structure, and I'm circling back to the previous question, did you have such a curve that or everybody could get an A in your class? Was that possible? Was that a problem for you?
No, I decided to go into the class that this class would not be graded on a curve, and the reason that it was not graded on a curve was I didn't want to make this class a competition between students, because really the outcome of the class was I was trying to measure the learning outcomes for the students. Would they become better communicators? Would they become better public speakers? Would they be better able to research their topic of interest? And then would they be able to deliver that content to someone in a way that they could understand it? And making it a competitive environment just did not fit those learning outcomes. I realized that with other classes and other institutions, making it competitive is a good gamification and educational choice. But for this class, I really wanted it to be not just cooperative, but one that is supportive of each other. So no, I didn't structure it to be graded on a curve. If everyone had done the work perfectly, or not even done the work perfectly, if everyone had put in the medium amount of effort, they could have earned an A in the class. And that's how I wanted it to be.
That's fantastic. And being conscious and aware of the way that you want to treat your students in that way, in that direction, is very, very important.
Yep.
So now, Dave, we're going to move into what we like to call the second part of this interview, where we're going to explore a few sort of rapid fire questions. And you told me before that you had listened to the podcast previously, so I'm sure you know exactly what we're talking about.
Yep.
And the first question is there, if there's something, some element, some strategy, or something that you could call a best practice that almost any professor or teacher using game-based learning or gamification could benefit from?
So one thing, and I think Fitbit does this really well when it was first introduced in the market, is you want to provide feedback that's unexpected. Unexpected, but still useful. So what Fitbit was originally was it was just a device that measured steps, but like, basically pedometers were around for quite some time. There were other devices that could measure steps. But what Fitbit did, and was really great, was they not only gave you feedback on how many steps you've taken, but also provided you feedback on how many steps you'd taken compared to other people that you had connected with. So they integrated the social element. Measuring steps was the very beginning, and really they knew that any other device could do that. But what other devices weren't doing was showing you how you compared against everyone else. And I know you asked about it before. This is a scenario where you wanted to be competitive, because in making the situation competitive, you get people to participate in the activity, which is the end goal, which is to become more active, to walk more, to exercise more. So in this situation, yes, you want to be competitive, and Fitbit was able to do that by providing feedback that was unexpected, but was what was rewarding in also helping people reach that end outcome, which was being more active.
Fantastic. That's a great example that's been used pretty widely in general. The Fitbit example is something that the Fitbit, the Nike Plus, all these examples have been widely used, but there's many angles from which you can take it and many learnings from different pieces that you can take. And that's a fundamental learning. When you're going to use competition, use it consciously, be aware that you're using it and what it's for, if it's helping you to reach your objectives, which in this case, clearly it is. And the next question, we were talking about all the tabletop games that you have. So this is going to be a difficult one. What would you say is your favorite game?
Oh man, so Rob, this is really difficult because I'm literally staring at my 4 IKEA bookshelves full of tabletop games right now. But I'll try to narrow it down because I'd listened to enough episodes to know that this was coming. My favorite game I like playing right now is a board game called Azul. And it is a game of just these really beautiful colored tiles and this grid. And like I tell people when I explain the game to them, this game is all about taking these beautiful tiles and putting them on the grid. And I tell them, if you've ever played Sudoku, it's like Sudoku, but instead of numbers, it's colors. And the part that I really like about it, and something that I really appreciate about this type of tabletop board game design, is that it has a very elegant flow. Like you do this, then you can do this. Then you do this, then you can do this. Then your opponent does this, and it kind of limits your option. Or you do this, and it limits your opponent's options. And I really, really love it because it has this elegant flow where every turn you're doing something very simple. But the simplicity of those actions add up into something that's much more complex and much more elaborate. And I think it was recognized because it just won the award for Spiel des Jahres, which is Game of the Year in Essen. There's this large convention every year in Essen, Germany, where tabletop game players and manufacturers and publishers and designers get together and they vote on what will be the game of the year. And to win this award is no easy feat, but it won this year's Spiel Award for Game of the Year. So it is my favorite game to play right now. I don't know if it'll be my favorite game to play forever, but it's one that is near and dear to my heart.
That's fantastic. And is there, just drifting a bit off topic, is there something that you would say that game you could learn from that game, or that you could use that game in a class that could be interesting for using it in education in some shape or manner?
Yeah, so for me, it is, again, going back to that very elegant decision-making model. And that decision-making model is really limited by this game, by the structure of it. Like you can really only take maybe at maximum, like on your first turn, you have like 8 different options. But after every single turn, you'll have like 7 options, then 6, then 3, then 2 different options. So I think it is really elegant in the way that, one, it gives players the agency to determine how many options they'll have in future turns. And 2, it relates to education because when we can give students meaningful options, then I think we put them in a place to give them agency. And a bad example of this is when you're trying to advise students on what classes they have to take in order to fulfill a major. We have a whole curriculum sheet, like you can take this class, but then that means you have to take these 3 classes 3 semesters in a row. Or if you take this class now, you won't have to take that class later. Like it's almost as bad as doing your taxes. Whereas in the class that I tried to set up, I really gave students 2 3 options that they could do every like week or every module. And those 3 options, while it is, a very basic scheme, allows them to really build out how the rest of the class will work for them. So I really think that elegant like decision tree and how you make decisions in the model is just really great and something I'm very enamored with.
It's interesting. Precisely today, I was on my LinkedIn. This was a discussion in Spanish with somebody here from Spain, and they had shared an article of, I think it's a Swedish professor of Spanish in Sweden, and she was going forth and defending. She was a professor with a lot of experience. And she was saying that, the old way is actually something that we're kind of forgetting, and that it's fundamental, because in the class, what you need to have is discipline, and you need to have people sitting down and all reading books all day and doing exactly what you tell them. They have to respect the professor. And I'm not going to say I disagree with having a certain level of order and having people respect their teachers, their professors. But what you're saying of giving agency is something that's very near and dear to me. I've seen the difference between giving somebody 2 or 3 options that they're all conducted towards the same objective. But if you give your students the possibility to choose, then they're able to own their own decisions, and they are going to go through that path because they chose that path, and they're going to be more committed. And when you're committed and when you're engaged, you're definitely able to learn more. So this is an interesting discussion that we had today. It's definitely, there's no final word on these things, but my perspective, I think I share quite a bit with you, Dave, in the sense that giving students the agency to choose is something that is beautiful, and that the results can be amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
So Dave, is there anybody that you would like to listen to interviewed in this podcast in Professor Game?
Sure. So I recently had the great honor to attend the first Tabletop Network conference in Utah last month. So this was a collection of designers and would-be designers who want to develop games specifically for like the board game tabletop environment. And one of the first keynote speakers was Rob Davio. And I don't know if a lot of your past listeners have heard of him before. He is a designer that's been designing tabletop games for a very, very long time. He used to work for Hasbro, and now he started his own company. But his real keynote about the process was that this is the first time we're getting together and doing this. Normally in the tabletop game design process, it's very shrouded in like mystery, because there's not a lot of people out there that want to do it. Most people want to create digital games, video games, PC games, console games. So that he welcomed us to this environment, and he also gave us some words of wisdom about that kind of like that elegant decision making process, making decisions for games that are in theme with what you want people to feel, and what you want them, what kind of emotions you want to evoke, and what kind of decisions you want them to make. And that this process of creating tabletop games is different than creating any other type of video games, because in tabletop games, it's really left up to us, the players, to create that social experience, whereas that is not really the case in a lot of other games. And he was just very influential. And if you can get him on the show, I think it'd be great, because not only is he a great person to talk to, he's also just a very great and talented speaker.
Fantastic. He sounds like a very interesting person to get his perspectives, especially on how can games as well be designed for something as important and as pervasive as education in today's world.
Exactly.
So Dave, is there any book that you would recommend to the engagers?
I think he had mentioned before, but I would say Theory of Fun by Ralph Koster. At that same conference, I met Ralph Koster. I got to play some of his games with him. He's a very endearing person, and I think that everything that he wrote about in Theory of Fun can be applied in multiple different areas. It doesn't have to be used for games. It has applications in psychology, sociology, education, economics, anything else. But one of the key takeaways I take from that book is like, what is the fun here? Like, why would people want to do this? Because one of the descriptions I used for games and definitions is that a game is an artificial challenge. Like with people that have real challenges that they're going through everyday life, why would they ever want to have an artificial challenge? But that's what games are, and people want to play them because there's something intrinsically fun and motivating about them. So I think The Theory of Fun by Ralph Koster, that should be seminal reading for anyone that wants to get involved with games or gamification or games-based learning.
And it is a fantastic book, Engager, so very, very recommended.
Yep.
Dave, what would you say is your superpower when using games-based learning or gamification in a classroom?
So for me, it would be that alignment. Specifically, when I work with clients doing instructional design work, we're always trying to find alignment. Like starting with the very first thing is what is the learning outcome? Like after students participate in this activity or whatever, what is the learning outcome? What do you want them to achieve? Then what is the content that supports that? Sometimes it's videos, sometimes it's reading, sometimes it is a lecture. But in the games-based learning sphere, we can make that the game. So what is that learning outcome? How do we find a game that matches to that? And then how do we also assess that students have learned something from there? And in the past, we can use tests, we can use quizzes, we can use exams, we can use papers, we can use discussions. Or in this case, we can actually use the game itself. Like, do we give people an objective in the game, but do we also give them a secret like learning objective? Like in this game, we want you to specifically do this. And then we'll talk about it afterwards. Like, how did they feel about getting that objective? And how do they feel about trying to accomplish it in that realm? So for me, this speaks about good instructional design. It's all about how everything aligns. What is the outcome? What is the activity? And then how will you assess that activity to determine if students were able to achieve that outcome?
I love that superpower, and I was just wanting to add something else. And it's you mentioned instructional design, and there's a bunch of people now starting to call it learning experience design, which is, I think, when you listen to the words, it makes a lot more sense to what you actually do every day, because you're not only creating a list of things to do one after the other. You're actually creating an experience for your learners. So I love that term. I don't know if you share that with me, but it's something that I think describes very deeply what a person like you can bring forth to the table.
Yeah, exactly. It goes further than just user design or user experience design, because not only are we trying to design an experience, but we need to design an experience in which someone will learn from. So it's a completely new but burgeoning field.
Absolutely. So now, Dave, we're going to move into a question, which is the random question that we get from the audience. And this question, you clearly don't know which question it was. And I'm going to pick it up right now, and I'm just going to read it to you. So, okay. This person says, I like what this gamification thing sounds like, but have never seen it myself. How can I know if this is for me? And if so, how could I get started?
So gamification is interesting because it is something that is coming to the forefront right now, and it's very interesting because it has the word game in it. But what I tell some of my clients and what I tell other people, other engagers, other educators and designers, is I ask them first, what is the issue you're trying to solve? And they'll talk about that issue and anything else. And I can say, okay, what have you done to address it? They'll talk about that. And I'll also ask them, can you address this issue, and will it work if you don't use games? And actually 9 times out of 10, they can come up with a resolution that does not use games. And I will tell them, great, go do that. Because if you want to use gamification, if you want to use game-based learning, it's going to be a more intensive process. Going back to learning experience design, that is not easy work to do. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it also takes a lot of experience in order to put that together. So the first thing I tell people is that gamification is not for everyone. If you know how to use gamification and you know how to use game-based learning, that is like you having access to a hammer. But if that is the only tool in your toolbox, then that means that every problem you see is going to be a nail, because you want to use gamification as that tool that you have. But every problem is not a nail. Sometimes it's a bolt, or you'll need a screwdriver or something, or you'll need a saw. So the takeaway I can tell people is to not only explore gamification as an application, but also explore other opportunities as applications. Gamification really should be a new tool rather than a new solution for any problem we're trying to tackle.
Definitely. And what would you say, how should somebody, if this person apparently hasn't heard too much about gamification and is not sure whether to use it or not, but if this person decided that gamification or games-based learning is the thing to do, what would you advise them to get started with?
So there's many good books out there. I know that past listeners have talked about both of Jane McGonigal's books, that is Reality is Broken and Super Better. I also talked about The Theory of Fun by Ralph Koster. I took one course and I also read the book by Kevin Werbach at the University of Pennsylvania, For the Win, Gamification for Your Business. So that's a course on Coursera. That's also a book that he published with his co-author, Dan Hunter. Any of those books are really good into the to the field. I would recommend just picking one of them, reading a couple chapters. If it sounds engaging and if it sounds interesting, continue reading. But I would say if you just start small with any one of those areas or any number of blogs online, you could also listen to Professor Game, which you're listening to right now. There's any number of podcasts available too. So I would say start small, see if that's interesting, and then go from there.
That's a fantastic recommendation, and thank you very much for that, Dave. So now we're almost running out of time, and it's time to know if you have any further advice that you would like to leave the engagers with, and then we'll say it's game over.
My piece of advice, and I say this to anyone that plays games, uses games, or anything else, is that games for me are a very social experience. It's something that I do because I want to engage with others. I want to learn from each other, and I also want to play with each other. So if you've ever seen 2010, The Year We Make Contact, that is the sequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'd like to repeat the message that the alien beings from that talk, which is that this is something that they've left for humanity to use together. Use it together. Use it in peace. I hope that everyone can play more games together.
Fantastic advice, and bringing in the social element is beautiful with games and gamification. Can you let us know how can we connect with you, if there's any specific place or places that you would like for us to contact you through, and then we'll say bye-bye.
Sure. So number one place would be my website. It's www.daveengdesign.com. That's DAVENG design.com. I'm also on Twitter at DAVENG design.com, or just at Dave Eng Design. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook, so you can just search for me anyway. Just search DAV space ENG, Dave Eng, and you can find me on any of those channels online.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for your time, for all the knowledge that you've spilled over here to us, the engagers. And now it's time to say game over.
Thanks, Rob. I'm glad to be here. Game over.
Hey, engagers. Thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. How are you listening to this podcast? If it's through a podcasting app, have you subscribed and rated this podcast? If you're enjoying it, please do so. That way we can reach more engagers like you to achieve our mission of making learning amazing. If you want the instructions, you can go to professorgame.com/iTunes. And before you go to your next mission, would you like to know how Leonard Naki does his games user research? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.